Welcome back. Remember last time we were talking about the Nubians, and for the first time we have Egypt ruled by sort of its neighbor in the Sudan. Well, Egypt continues to go downhill. It's a sad story, but don't be depressed. There are some great pharaohs coming ahead. Egypt is invaded by Libyans. They're repelled by the Nubians. Then we get the Assyrians. Then we get the Babylonians. And then we get the Persians. And then we get to the Greeks, the last foreign rulers of Egypt. And today I'd like to talk about maybe the greatest of them all, Alexander the Great. Now, first let me say this. There is a legend, and it's just a medieval legend, that Alexander the Great was Egyptian. Egyptian, right? It shows how deeply ingrained it was that the ruler of Egypt should be legitimate. The legend goes this way, and it's not true, just a legend. The last native ruler of Egypt, right, the last native ruler, was Nectanebo II. He had to flee Egypt. Had to flee Egypt because of the Persians. He flees, and according to the legend, he goes to Macedonia, where he is harbored in the court. And he seduces Alexander's mother, and Alexander's father is really the Egyptian king. Right? It's not true, but it's a neat legend. So let's start with reality. We know Alexander's real father, Philip II of Macedon. Now, remember at this point in history, there is no Greece. There is no country called Hellas. It's not a country yet. What we have are city-states. We've got a place like Athens, which is an independent political entity with its own constitution. We've got Sparta, right? We've got Macedonia, right? So these are independent. And Alexander's father, Philip of Macedon, is trying to unite these city-states in a military effort. They are fighting the Persians. And he needs all the support he can get. But Philip is assassinated. Right? Alexander's father is killed. And at the age of 20, Alexander takes over the Macedonian army. Now, Alexander's career is going to have 3 stages. It's Alexander as a military man, Alexander as a pharaoh, ruler of Egypt, and Alexander as a legend. At the age of 20, he fights the Persians and defeats Darius III at Issus and has conquered. It's all over. The Persians are history. What does Alexander do as his first sort of victory dance, as his happy dance? He goes to Egypt. Interesting move. Doesn't go for military conquests. He goes to Egypt. Now, why does Alexander go to Egypt? First, you have to understand that Alexander has this heritage, this Greek heritage, though there's no formal Greek, of revering the Egyptians. The Greeks, if you'll remember, loved to trace their heritage to Egypt. The Greeks are newcomers on the scene, right? The oldest literature we have of Greek literature is is Homer, Iliad and the Odyssey. Maybe 900 BC. Nothing compared with Sneferu's 2700 BC. So the Greeks loved to trace everything from the Egyptians. They said, for example, we learned mathematics from the Egyptians. They were proud of saying that. Pythagoras goes into Egypt, supposedly. So Alexander wants to go to Egypt. Reveres them. He's not coming in as a conqueror and is going to milk it for all he can get. No. He has a goal. He wants to be declared a god, like an Egyptian pharaoh. So he goes to Egypt, and when he enters Egypt, I think he enters not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. The Persians were cruel, brutal, and Alexander must have been welcomed, absolutely welcomed. Now he goes to Egypt, and there are 3 major events in his Egyptian sojourn. We don't know the order in which they occur. We don't. But we know they occurred. He goes to the Siwa oasis. I'll talk about that. He is crowned as Pharaoh. We'll talk about that. And he founds the city of Alexandria. So we will deal with all three. Let's first talk about the Siwa oasis and why Alexander goes there. The Siwa oasis is remote. It is off the beaten track. It is in the west, 38 miles from Libya. In order to get to Siwa from Egypt, you have to cross a really inhospitable desert. Dangerous. How dangerous? Cambyses, the Persian ruler, lost an army of 50,000 men on the way to Siwa. They set out, disappeared, and were never seen again. There are no roads to Siwa. They were going through the desert. Perhaps a sandstorm swallows them, but they are gone. It's interesting, by the way. Somebody's going to find them. There are 50,000 soldiers out there somewhere. I have a friend, as a matter of fact, who has a project to look for it. He's going to use remote sensing devices that can pick up metal, and he's going to fly low-flying planes over and try to pick up, I mean, if you've got 50,000 swords somewhere, they will be visible in some way. So I think in the near future you're going to see Cambyses' lost army. But getting to Siwa was not an easy matter. I mean, I can tell you how remote it is. I've been there several times. And I remember the first time I was going there. It's an oasis, so it's got its own water supply, but it's isolated. And I remember reading in a book, and I'd never been there, so I read about it, that the language that the people speak there isn't Arabic. It's Berber. That's how remote they are. And the Berber numbering system, it goes 1, 2, 3, many. It stops at 3. You know, so like, how many sheep do you have? A lot, you know, or 3, or 2, or 1. That's the option. And I remember what they do nowadays is the locals at Siwa, they substitute Arabic numbers for 3, 4, 5, and 6. So, for example, they have their Berber number 1, 2, 3, and then when they get to 4, they say Arba, which is Arabic for 4. They say Khamsa, which is Arabic for 5. So they picked up the Arabic numbers, but this place is remote, right? And Alexander is willing to risk it. He knows Cambyses lost 50,000 men, but he's going to go. Now, why? The answer is there is an oracle at Siwa. Now, an oracle is a way of telling the future. There are different kinds of oracles. Egypt had a tradition of oracles. They had oracle statues. Statues of the god that supposedly could talk. Now, we don't have any of these statues that seem to suggest the mechanism, you know, like a puppet with a jaw that goes open and closed. Don't have statues like that. I think many of these oracle statues were statues in the temple, and a priest hid behind it and spoke for it. That's my hunch. But there are other statues, and we have documents that attest to this. At festival times, the statue would be taken out of the temple and put on a shrine which was on poles carried on the shoulders of priests. And during a festival, these statues would be paraded by the priests, and a person, a commoner even, could approach the statue and ask it a question. And we have, I think it's the first signed document in history, of a priest who wanted to be relieved of his duties in a temple. He wanted to move to another town. And he had to get permission of the god. So when the statue was brought out, he approached and he asks, "May I be relieved of my duty?" And the document says the statue dipped down in assent. I think the idea obviously is controlled by the priests, but this was another way that statues could be oracles, could give answers. And as a matter of fact, this was legally binding in court. That is, you had a choice. If you had a legal decision to be made, you could go to a court of elders where there were judges, elders of the village, and they would make a decision. Or you could go to the temple and ask the oracle statue for a verdict. And it was legally binding. We have actual cases, documents, where statues were asked to settle legal disputes. So-and-so supposedly stole my shirt. And you go before the statue, and the statue would decide it. So this is a tradition of oracles in Egypt making decisions, things like that. Now, the oracle at Siwa is the other kind of oracle. It is a person. It was a man, a priest. Now, this kind of oracle is something that the Greeks were familiar with. If you know your Plato, where he talks about Socrates, and Socrates is on trial for his life, and Socrates mentions, you know, I'm being persecuted because everybody thinks I'm so smart. I'm really not so smart. And he says, I know Chaerephon went to the oracle at Delphi and asked it, who's the wisest in the world? And they said Socrates. Right? So the Greeks went to oracles. And the oracle at Delphi was one that they were familiar with. Just recently, by the way, it's been discovered that the oracle at Delphi, who was a woman, was intoxicated when she made her pronouncements. Delphi was situated on a fault in the rock, and from that rock came sulfuric fumes. And when she went down, she was intoxicated, and then would make her have her visions and say this. So it's kind of interesting that these oracles were in an altered state. Perhaps we'd call it an altered state. Now, Alexander knows about oracles like Delphi, and he has heard that there is an oracle at Siwa, and he wants to see the oracle. So he undertakes the journey. And according to the tradition, Alexander gets lost with his men. Not unlike Cambyses. He's not taking a whole army. But he gets lost. And he is saved by crows. Black crows. He sees them overhead, and he follows them, and they take him to the oasis. Now, this isn't quite so shocking, surprising, unbelievable. Because you have, of course, mariners have always known when you see birds, you're near land. Crows are not going to hang out in the desert where there's no food or water. So perhaps he did follow the crows. But he arrives at Siwa. Now, Siwa is striking when you come out of the desert. I mean, I've been there a few times, and it's really wonderful. You're going through desert, driving, and there it is, lush and green. Thousands of date palms. It's just spectacular. There's bubbling streams. You know, after the desert, it must have seemed fabulous to Alexander. But he didn't come to eat the dates. He wanted to see the oracle. Now, the oracle resided in a temple on top of a hill. It's very impressive because the rock outcropping on which the temple sits comes out of the date palms. So you can see it from far. It's way above the height of the palms. Now, he approaches the temple, Alexander. We don't know where he met the oracle. We don't know exactly where he sees the oracle, even as he sees him. See, an Egyptian temple has a very clever kind of architecture. Egyptian temples are in a straight axis, and they're designed to give you kind of a psychological feeling that you're going into more and more sacred space as you go in. First, you have an open court, open to the sky, and this is where the noble people could come during a festival or something like that. But then you go to an enclosed room, the hypostyle hall. It has a roof. You go up a ramp, and now you have a roof. So you don't have open sky. So it's getting smaller. You're going up, and the roof is coming on. And then you go into the Holy of Holies, in the back of the temple. You go up a ramp again, and the roof gets smaller. So you're going into more and more enclosed space, more and more sacred space. Now, in the Holy of Holies was the statue, and this is probably where the oracle stayed, and only the high priests were permitted inside the Holy of Holies. So I don't know if Alexander ever got to the Holy of Holies. I would bet not. Even Alexander, I think, they would keep him at bay. When Alexander comes, he undoubtedly brings a gift for the oracle. In Greek tradition, you brought a goat to Delphi, something like a goat or a sheep, and depending upon which way the goat bleated, like blah or bleh, that would determine whether the oracle would give you an answer. So Alexander approaches the oracle, perhaps with his goat or whatever. He's reverential. He really is respectful of Egyptian tradition. And he asks one question. This is why Alexander has come across the desert, risked his life to ask the oracle one question. Who is my father? Now, he knows his father is Philip of Macedon. But Alexander wants to be crowned as Pharaoh. And every Pharaoh is the son of the sun. The Egyptian words are Sare. And before he can be crowned as Pharaoh, the oracle has to say, your father is the sun. The oracle is politically correct. He knows where his bread is buttered. And he says, your father is the sun. So it is a successful voyage, journey. Alexander is declared son of the sun and then returns to Egypt, mainstream Egypt. The other event of the three that we know occurs is that he is crowned Pharaoh. I think it happens after the oracle proclaims him son of the sun. That makes sense. And Alexander is now a god, right? He's starting his legend phase, I think. Interesting, by the way, he writes his name in a cartouche, like all Egyptian pharaohs, but he's got a bit of a grammatical problem. There is no X in the Egyptian alphabet. And Alexander, of course, has the X in his name. So he cleverly takes the Egyptian K and S, puts them together for an X, right? The K and S sounds like an X, and he has his name in a cartouche. He even builds a small temple in Thebes, in the south. He wants to be an Egyptian. This is not a Greek trying to plunder. He wants to be the Egyptian king. So he builds a small temple. Now, his other event in Egypt, he founds the city of Alexandria. Now, Alexander founded 12 cities named Alexandria. Wherever he went, he founded a city. But this one took. This one became great. We have an awful lot of information about the founding of this city. We know the architect's name, Dinocrates. And according to the tradition, Alexander and Dinocrates walked the land, laying out the city. Now, remember, the Egyptians were not great sailors. Didn't go on the Mediterranean often. So this port is no big deal to them. They never built large cities. So think of it as land, open land. And Alexander is walking with Dinocrates to lay out the city. Now, cleverly, they decide to have a grid. The streets are going to be in straight rows as a grid. And they're laying it out. They don't have chalk, which is a tradition that they use, chalk. So they take grain. And they're kind of dropping the grain as they're going, showing where the streets are going to go. And they plan it to take advantage of the Mediterranean breezes, right? They're going to take advantage of these breezes so it'll be cool. He plans the city. Now, this is a purely Greek thing. Alexander is thinking in terms of a port and going outward. The Egyptians always thought in terms of isolation. They didn't want to go anywhere, right, except to beat up a country, take back everything. Now, the Egyptians always thought of themselves as isolated. Desert on one side protects me. Desert on another side protects me. Cataracts in the south protect me. Mediterranean isolates me. They liked isolation. The Greeks sail everywhere, fearless, right? So Alexander is thinking, port, we're going to use this place to go outward. So he founds Alexandria. But he doesn't stay long. Founds the city, crowned Pharaoh, and leaves. He has other fish to fry. He is going to do other things. Now, Alexander wants to conquer everything. He is undoubtedly one of the greatest generals that ever lived. Maybe not because of his strategic abilities, but because the men would follow him anywhere. They really viewed him as a god. So Alexander sets out with his Macedonian army of 50,000. Now, what is it like to travel with Alexander, right? With the army of 50,000. First of all, it's slow moving. It's not just the soldiers. There are hangers-on. There are women. There are people who sell provisions to the army. So it is a slow-moving mess. Now, if you left on the expedition with Alexander, you better kiss the wife and kids goodbye, because you may not be coming back for 10 years. Think about what they're going to do. They are going to walk to India. That is some trip. I mean, you may not be coming back, period. So Alexander has this huge army, which is very difficult to supply. For example, water, as you know, 50,000 men, you got 4 wells, you'll die of thirst. You've got to have lots of water. How do you do that? The answer is Alexander actually had water ships going along the coast when they were near a coast, bringing water. Food, what do? You plan way in advance. You plan when harvest time is, and then you go through that time so you can get food for your men. So it's not easy moving this army, and Alexander moves all the way to India. He goes from Babylon, Susa, and India. He is never defeated. Alexander is undefeated. But at India, his men say, no more. They want to go home. Alexander agrees. He wanted to go on. He wanted to keep going. But no. He says, okay, we'll go back. And they start the long march back. Now, it must have been an interesting march back, because the men would have met women they had married. As Alexander marched to India, he realized that if you're really going to conquer a people or rule them, you have to be integrated with them. See, the Egyptians never mingled with foreigners. They were beneath them, right? Never. They never wanted to live. The Egyptians never wanted to live in a foreign country. They never colonized. And I think part of the reason was their belief in life after death. If you died in Syria, far from the embalming workshops, you couldn't be mummified, and you wouldn't have a chance at immortality. So the Egyptians never colonized, never let people there. I mean, even an ambassador to a foreign country didn't like the job, because if he died there, he was losing immortality. Alexander was very different. He realized you got to mingle with the people, and he often encouraged mass marriages wherever the men went. They married the women of the men they killed, right, in battle. So you have these mass marriages, and as the men are going back, they must have met women they had married, maybe even children, and they start the long road back. They get as far as Babylon, where Alexander becomes sick. Now, we have accounts of what was wrong with Alexander. He ran high fevers for quite a while. There's been a lot of speculation what it was. Could have been dysentery, something like that. Could even been malaria, perhaps. But he is running high fevers for quite a while, and at some point it becomes clear Alexander is going to die. The generals gather around him, and they ask him. Now remember, Alexander has conquered the known world. He's conquered as much as anybody's seen. And he's got this empire. And the generals ask him, to whom does the empire go? They want Alexander to name the successor. Alexander's answer is the fittest. He does not name anyone. It will go to whoever is strongest. Interesting response. And he dies, leaving no successor named. The solution among the generals is that the empire is so vast, that they divide the empire among them. And different generals get different pieces. Now, our interest is Egypt. And Egypt goes to a general named Ptolemy. Ptolemy becomes the ruler of Egypt. But this doesn't end the story of Alexander. He's a legend. He dies in Babylon, and he remains there for a year. The body lies in state, we can call it, for a year. How did they preserve it? We know that the tradition is that it lay in spices of some kind. We're not sure what it is. They didn't have Egyptian embalmers there, so he's not mummified in the traditional Egyptian way. But it's preserved in spices. Now, why is it laying in state for a year? The answer is they have to build a catafalque, something to transport the body back to Macedon. And it's going to be of solid gold. And it takes a year to get enough gold and Greek goldsmiths to Babylon to build this incredible edifice. Right? This is how much Alexander was revered. They weren't just going to bring the body back. This was Alexander the Great. So for a year he lies in state while the gold is pouring into Babylon. Goldsmiths are coming and they're fashioning this incredible catafalque, which is in the shape of a temple. And on the temple walls, it's a kind of combination, temple and tomb. On the temple walls are Alexander's victories, scenes from Alexander's victories. Now we have some accounts of the transport of Alexander's body. It was pulled, it was on wheels, big gold thing with the body, pulled on wheels by teams of mules. And each mule had a gold bell around its neck to announce to each city that Alexander was entering. So it starts this long journey back home. When the body reaches Syria, north of Egypt, just north of Egypt, Ptolemy, Alexander's general, they had been friends since youth, Ptolemy rides out with his army, apparently to salute the body, but it's more than that. He hijacks the body. He takes the body away from the cortege, right? Takes it to Egypt. Now why? The answer is Alexander's a legend. And it will greatly increase the status of the city he founded, Alexandria, if he is buried in Alexandria. Think of it. Alexandria should have the body of Alexander the Great. So Ptolemy, the general, hijacks this body and brings it to Egypt. Now we have some account of what happens to the body. It lies in state in Memphis, the capital, the administrative capital, while they are building the tomb of Alexander in Alexandria. The tomb is called the Soma, which is Greek. Body means the body, like somatic, psychosomatic. It is just called the body. And we have accounts of where the tomb was. It is at the crossroads of the two main streets of Alexandria that Alexander laid out. It takes years to build the tomb. Years. The body lies in state in Memphis, and finally, it is buried in Alexandria. Now, Alexander's story doesn't end there. His body has disappeared. I am often asked, are there any great discoveries to be made in Egypt? The answer is plenty. But the one I can point to that I think is really out there waiting to be found is the tomb of Alexander the Great. The reason it's still to be found is that the crossroads of ancient Alexandria have disappeared under modern Alexandria. We don't know where he's buried. We do know that the body was seen well after his burial. We know that later Greek rulers of Egypt opened the tomb, took his gold coffin, melted it down, and replaced it with a crystal coffin, supposedly. We know that supposedly Cleopatra showed the body, right, to someone. But now the body is gone. You may have heard about 10 years ago, a woman excavating in Egypt said she had found the body of Alexander the Great, the tomb, actually. She was a Greek. That's important. She would have liked to have found Alexander the Great. And her husband was a businessman who did the translations of the Greek inscriptions in this tomb she found. And he's Greek, but he's not an expert on classical Greek, and he mistranslated things. It wasn't the body of Alexander the Great or the tomb of Alexander the Great. The tomb of Alexander the Great is still to be found. But Alexander starts a tradition. For 300 years, Egypt will now be ruled by Greeks. And that's our story for next time. See you then.